Guten Erev Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. We're so excited. Shabbos is almost here. That was the beautiful song traditionally sung as we're awaiting Shabbos, Yedid Nefesh. That was the Moshav band singing it. Let's light up the darkness. All right. Such a beautiful song. That there's many melodies for it. That happens to be Nina's favorite melody. Yedid Nefesh, beloved of the soul, the father of compassion. Draw your servant to your will. Your servant will hurry like a hart, like the deer type of heart, to bow before your majesty. To him your friendship will be sweeter than the dripping of the honeycomb and any taste. It's just a song of beautiful longing for the presence of the Holy One and connection with the Holy One, who is with us as we do some fine learning on a Friday afternoon. Yehudit Sobel says, Shabbat Shalom, wishing Nina, Sal, and everyone a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos from Florence, South Carolina. Harold is with us from Oregon, Pauline in Arkansas, Ann in Merced. Paul says Shabbat Shalom from Minneapolis. Stephen in New Hampshire. Nina says my favorite Yedid Nefesh tune. Lisa wishing you love from Arlington. Pauline loves the music. James Roth is with us from Indianapolis. Sammy in Dallas. Phyllis says shalom from Comac. Comac, where's Comac? Is that Wisconsin? I don't know where I'm getting that, but it sounds familiar to me. Maggie Lynn Scott says, Sameach Erev Shabbos, some joy to everybody on this Erev Shabbos, and Paul is in Louisiana. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn is with us in Texas. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Dove Blauner in honor of the Magen Am team. You've heard me talk about it before. I'm one of the members of Magen Am, a small force of trained people, highly trained, so that we can protect small synagogues that don't have the means to hire armed guards. Tragically, we live in a dangerous time, and so there's a small cadre of committed people who have undergone extensive training so that we can carry firearms in shul and protect our community. God forbid we should ever need to. Thank you, Dove, for your dedication to AT Daily today. May you and your family and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and may the members of Magen Am grow and never have to need these skills. And we say Amen. Before we get into today's daf, very interesting stuff we're going to be covering. I just wanted to share one more teaching this week in the name of Rabbi Avraham Twersky, MD, psychiatrist and Hasidic rabbi. We lost him tragically at the beginning of the week. He was our Thursday hero. We shared a number of teachings in his name this week. He wrote 60 books. There's no end to what we can learn from Rav Twersky. He lived to be 90. We still feel that his life was cut tragically short. He had so much to share. He said that really all his 60 books were on the same subject, raising people's self-esteem. If people knew how beautiful every soul is, how beautiful they are, they would not engage in the kind of destructive behaviors that lead to substance abuse, addiction, and all kinds of other issues, self-destructive behaviors. He was actually an addiction and recovery specialist within the field of medical psychiatry. So he wrote many books. I shared a Hasidic story earlier in the week, the story of the wedding and the officer of the Tsar's army and the miser. Here I'm just sharing a very, very short teaching in his name. I actually asked God to guide me, please, to share something with our accidental Talmudist community, and I took this book, Living Each Day. He has teachings for every day of the year. And I opened the book at random, and this is what the Holy One brought me to. So he's commenting on the verse in Leviticus 26:44, where the Torah says, "And yet for all that, even when they are in the land of their enemies, I have not despised them nor abhorred them to make an end of them, to break my covenant with them, for I, God, remain their God." So commenting on that line, that, the Jewish people can stray very far and lose the protection that we've enjoyed, at times where we're much closer to God, like when the kingdom of Israel was there and the temple was standing in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, the Lord never forsakes his people. So on this idea, Rav Twersky writes a story about Rabbi Zev Kitzes, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was the founder of Hasidic Judaism. So Rabbi Zev Kitzes, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, was an ardent traveler. On one of his excursions, he met a man dressed in Oriental clothes who inquired about the situation of the Jews in Europe. So the Baal Shem Tov was active in the late 1700s. Obviously a very different time than our own, long before the Holocaust, but the predicament of the Jews around the world has always been pretty precarious. Ever since we lost our own land, we've been a wandering people, and at times found safety in a host land, and at other times, just monstrous anti-Semitism, attempted genocide, persecution, etc. In every age, our enemies rise up to destroy us, and the Holy One delivers us from their midst. That's the line from the Passover Haggadah. So, says Rabbi Zev, right, when he reports back to the Baal Shem Tov that in his travels, he met this man in Oriental clothes who asked about the situation of the Jews in Europe. And Rabbi Zev answered his question: God does not forsake them. What is the situation of the Jews in Europe? Says Rabbi Zev, God does not forsake them. Upon his return, he related this encounter to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov began weeping. Quote, "We lost an opportunity for the redemption," he said. "Every so often, the patriarch Abraham comes down to earth to inquire as to the welfare of his descendants. Had you told him of our distress, of our persecution, of our spiritual impoverishment," right? That's not the result of our enemies chasing us. Our spiritual impoverishment is our own doing. "And our longing to return to Jerusalem to live in the radiance of the divine presence, he would have interceded to hasten our redemption. But no, you had to reassure him that all was well." Of course it is true, says Rav Twersky, that God does not forsake us, but that should never satisfy our spiritual aspirations. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. It's like, if you've been with me for a while, I'm the type of person that is going to look for the positive aspect in every situation. I'm just wired that way. And that's good. That's generally good. We should, because it's a mitzvah to be happy. It's a mitzvah to cultivate joy in ourselves. We can actually come closer to God in a state of joy than in a state of apathy. The sages also teach that the gate of tears is always open, and perhaps that's the surest way to get close to God, is the gate of tears. And so we should remember that definitely we want to look for the bright side of things. Definitely we want to appreciate all our blessings. We who are blessed to live in America, I mean, has there ever been so much freedom and protection for a Jewish community? But nevertheless, our community has major problems, starting with 80% of the Jews have no connection to Judaism whatsoever. We are a people spiritually impoverished, spiritually starving. And we shouldn't forget that, right? So even as we celebrate our blessings and move into Shabbos and we want to be in a state of joy, we should remember that so many of our brothers and sisters are completely ignorant of Judaism and of Torah. They're in a state of spiritual impoverishment, and if we can share a little bit of inspiring Torah with them, we should. And we should cry and pray for our entire people and for the whole world to be elevated and to come spiritually a little higher, a little nearer to the source of spirituality, to the source of holiness, our Father in heaven. And as we long for that connection, if we can, if we can, what's the word I'm looking for? If we can infect the whole world with a longing, that's the kind of pandemic that we should have, a pandemic of spiritual longing where everyone is longing, right, to come close to our Father in heaven and to each other and to rise all together in song and spirituality and goodness and helping each other. Then we'd all be a little bit better off. And we say Amen. Okay. So where are we holding? Today's page is Daf. Where am I? It's Ayin Zion, right? It's Ayin Zion. Yes, we're on page 76 of Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We are in chapter 7. We have been studying the particulars of the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, not only how it's brought, but how it is cooked. Right now we're talking about how it is cooked so that it can be eaten. We can't eat the Paschal lamb today. We haven't been able to in nearly 2,000 years since the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. It has become impossible to bring the Korban Pesach. So of course we honor and remember Passover. We celebrate Passover with myriad rules every year, but the one thing that we cannot do is bring the Passover offering because the temple was destroyed, and that is a big part of our longing on Passover. Nevertheless, we study these laws, and that study takes the place of actually bringing the Korban Pesach and eating it. All right, so we're here in our second Mishnah. Let's get right into it. In today's discussion, we're going to read this Mishnah, and we're going to go right into the discussion just as it's written in the Talmud, and we'll take it slow and really get into the flow of the sages arguing these points about how cooking it can render the Korban Pesach prohibited if we make a mistake. So let's just do it. The Mishnah is, the second Mishnah here, chapter 7. If the Paschal lamb touched the earthenware surface of an oven, one must peel off its place on the Paschal lamb as it was roasted by the heat of the oven and not by the fire itself. Recall that the Torah states the Paschal lamb, it can also be a young goat, must be roasted in the fire. It cannot be eaten raw. It cannot be eaten boiled. It cannot be cooked. It must be roasted over fire. Now, it can be roasted over fire in an oven, a traditional oven of the Talmudic period, which is a large clay dome with a big wood fire inside it, right? And normally you would have the lamb on a wood spit, as we discussed in the first Mishnah. And it should be over the fire, even beside the fire can be okay. The issue here is as the oven gets very hot, if a piece of the lamb actually touches the sides of this earthenware clay oven, which has become superheated, now the meat is going to be cooked by its contact with the clay oven itself, and that would not be considered roasted over a fire, is what we're learning here in the Mishnah. If some of the gravy of the Paschal lamb dripped on the earthenware and then returned to it, i.e. the gravy splattered back onto the meat, one must remove its place, right? So the concept here is as the meat is roasting, okay, so if some of the gravy is able to splatter back onto the meat, what's the issue? So now it's like it was boiled. That part of the meat was actually boiled in its own gravy, in its own juices, rather than roasting directly from the fire. But it does not render the whole, lamb prohibited, just that part of it that got cooked from the boiling liquid coming back onto its surface, that just needs to be peeled off. Peeling off the outer layer is not enough. and one must remove some of the meat underneath the outer layer because it is considered to have been cooked by the liquid rather than roasted by the fire. So it's a question of how much this boiling gravy that comes back at the lamb can penetrate the surface of that meat. And it's not just the surface, right? It's not just you give it a wipe, you have to peel away some of that meat. If some of the Paschal lamb's gravy dripped onto hot flour, one must remove a handful of flour from its place, i.e., the place where the gravy landed in the flour, and destroy it. That one's a little bit confusing. We'll just leave it because we're going to be discussing it in the Gemara in a moment. In a case where one smears the Paschal lamb with teruma oil, so teruma oil meaning olive oil. The teruma is the olive oil producer, right? The olive farmer who's making olive oil. He's going to need to set aside the first 2% of his olive oil product as a gift to the Kohanim, the priests. That's called teruma. It's now been consecrated for the use of the priests. Only a priest can eat it. So in a case where one smears the Paschal lamb with teruma oil, so if the Paschal lamb belongs to a group of priests, they may eat it, as they are permitted to eat teruma. If the Paschal lamb belongs to a group of Israelites, then if it is still raw, one must rinse it in order to remove the teruma oil. This is because now there's only been contact between, cold oil and cold meat, and that is not going to change the status. And we're going to be discussing this momentarily. And this definitely has practical applications today for observant Jews because this affects kosher eating and the separation between milk and meat. And what happens if something dairy falls into a meat dish or vice versa? When does that permitted dish then become prohibited? Some of today's discussion is going to impact that question, inform that question. So with respect to this teruma oil, it can only be eaten by priests if somebody rubbed it on the Paschal lamb, and that lamb is registered to be eaten by non-priests, Israelites, as opposed to priests. Priests are the descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. So if it happened before the meat was cooked, when it was raw and cold, essentially, some cold oil got on some cold meat. So then you just wipe it off. If it is roasted, one must peel off the outer layer that has absorbed the oil so that the Israelites, these non-priests, do not eat the teruma consecrated oil, which is prohibited to them. If one smears the Paschal lamb with oil of the second tithe, right? So that's Meiser Sheni. The first thing if you live in the kingdom of Israel, when the temple is standing, and some of these laws are still existing today in a changed form. But if you're an agricultural producer, so the first 2% of your crop or of your fruit, harvest, whatever it's going to be, goes to the priest. The next 10% goes to the Levium, who did not receive a portion of the land along with the other tribes. Then the next 10% is for your own use, but it needs to be set aside. It is consecrated, and its purpose is that when you make the pilgrimage festival to Jerusalem for Passover, for Shavuos, for Sukkot, so you shouldn't go hungry while you're there. So God has commanded that you set aside the second tithe, the Meiser Sheni. This happens, there's a 7-year Shemitah cycle, right? So every 7th year, the farmers would not plant at all. That was the sabbatical year. And then in the 6 years previous to that, they are planting. In the 1st and 2nd, and in the 4th and 5th years, that second tithe is for their own use, so they have what to eat when they go to Jerusalem. In the 3rd and 6th year, it is for the poor, for the widow and the orphan, etc. So in that 1st, 2nd, and 4th and 5th years of the 7-year cycle, so you take the second 10% of your crop, and it's for you, so you have what to eat when you go up to Jerusalem. But, maybe you're an olive farmer. You don't only want to eat olives when you're up in Jerusalem. You don't want to carry huge sacks of olives with you. So that's fine. The Torah has already instituted, God said, so you sell it where you are in your town, where your farm is. You sell it, you convert it into money. But that money is consecrated money. You can only use it when you go on your pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, and now you have money to spend so that you can eat and drink and rejoice when you're up there in Jerusalem during the pilgrimage festival. So, but you could also take the produce itself. You don't have to change it for money. You can take the produce with you up to Jerusalem. So if one smears the Paschal lamb with oil of Meiser Sheni, of the second tithe, he may not demand money for it from the members of the group. Like, that's his contribution to the lamb. Fine, beautiful. But he can't say to them, hey, I just contributed oil that we smeared on our Paschal lamb. You guys should pay me back. Why can't he ask them to pay him back? Because this Meiser Sheni, the second tithe produce, you can redeem it for money in your town before you go up to Jerusalem. But once you get to Jerusalem, now you can't sell it. It's too late to sell it. You can't be selling your consecrated produce once you're in Jerusalem. Then it's too late. You have to sell it before you get to Jerusalem. Then you can use that money to buy food and drink while you're in Jerusalem, but you can't be selling it once you're in Jerusalem. Interestingly, also, if you redeem it to yourself, right? If you essentially sell it to yourself and convert it into money, then you have to add 1/5 of the value to the second tithe produce, the Meiser Sheni, before you go up to Jerusalem. Right, because it's interesting, right? Because we're always going to make mistakes in our own favor when we're handling both the buying and selling end of a deal by ourselves. If you just sell it to another party, okay, then they're just going to give you a fair price, and you know it's going to be fair how much money you got for that second tithe. But just in case you might be tempted to, give yourself not enough money or too much money or not enough money, that you buy it from yourself too cheaply, you have to add 20% of the value. So there's a good incentive to make sure you sell it to someone else and get the fair price for your own produce. Second tithe produce that is in Jerusalem is meant to be eaten. It may be given as a gift to others, but it may not be redeemed or sold once it's in Jerusalem. That's our Mishnah. Now we move on to the Gemara discussing these rulings of the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah. The Gemara says, based on the Mishnah, the Gemara introduces a general discussion concerning the laws of forbidden foods that come into contact with permitted foods. So it was stated that the Amoraim, right, so the rabbis of the Gemara, the later rabbis of the Talmudic period, disagreed with regard to these matters. But first, the Gemara mentions the cases that are clear, the areas where the rabbis agreed with each other. So if a hot food item falls into another hot item, for example, hot meat falls into boiling milk, or hot permitted meat falls into hot prohibited soup, all agree that the permitted foods become forbidden because they absorb some of the forbidden food. Right. So now, if you haven't grown up kosher and you're going to kosher your kitchen, right? You're going to start keeping kosher in your house, and you're going to have now separate plates for dairy dishes as for meat dishes, right? For melchig so that's Yiddish, or fleischig, which is meat in Yiddish. So you're going to have separate pots, separate plates, separate silverware. You're going to keep everything separate. And then, there's this question, well, what if you make a mistake and you have a dairy plate and some meat gets on it? Have you now taken this ceramic plate, which cannot be koshered, and sort of spoiled it so that now you can't use it anymore and you have to get rid of it? And the answer is there has to be a transfer of heat, right? And we see that here in these rulings, that if cold meat touches a cold plate, so there was no transfer of bits of food kind of on that molecular level, and the plate is going to remain permitted. But, if it's a hot plate and hot meat, a hot dairy plate and hot meat, for sure, now you're going to have a problem with that dish. And as we'll see, the problem is, the real question is, well, what if, a cold permitted food falls into a hot prohibited food, or a hot permitted food falls into a cold? When there's a mixture of hot and cold, that's where the rabbis are going to have a dispute. Let's continue. So they all agree that if a hot food item falls into another hot food item and one is permitted and the other is prohibited, now there's going to be like a transfer of particles of the prohibited into the permitted, and it's going to render what would otherwise have been a permitted food prohibited. Okay, so all agree. And if a cold item falls into another cold item, all agree it is permitted. The food needs only to be rinsed off. You still can't eat milk and meat together, even if it's cold. It's not like you have a bologna and cheese sandwich if you're keeping kosher. But if these things touch each other, all you have to do is rinse them off. There wasn't this transfer. Heat is required for that. The dispute pertains to a hot food item that falls into a cold one, or a cold food item that falls into a hot one. Obviously, you're doing this by mistake. That's why we're using the language of falling into, that it falls into. Now, here's the basic dispute is between Rav and Shmuel. Rav said the upper one prevails. The law is determined based upon the state of the upper substance, the one that falls in. If the upper food is hot, the case is judged as though a hot food fell into another hot food, because the upper food heats the lower food. If the upper food is cold, the case is similar to a situation where a cold food falls into another cold food, because the upper food cools down the lower one and prevents absorption. Right? So Rav has the opinion that it's the upper food that determines the outcome of this situation. So if, for example, a scoop of ice cream fell into a huge pot of a pot of lamb stew, according to Rav, right? So the upper one is the ice cream, and it's going to cool what it comes into contact with, and so there won't be this intermingling of hot and hot, which would render the stew prohibited. Shmuel is going to disagree with him, and he's going to say it's the lower one which controls, and the law will follow Shmuel. And it makes sense, because usually when one thing falls into another, the one that falls is small, and the one that it falls into is big. And you would think that it's the lower one is going to be more of the controlling factor, and the law indeed does follow Shmuel. What they're not going to talk about here is that we also have an important principle with respect to kosher kitchens and kosher utensils, and that is the idea of nullification. So if something that is less than 1/60th the total volume, like a spoonful of ice cream falls into a big pot of stew, so it's so little, it's so de minimis, the amount that falls in, it will be nullified, and it will not render that big, beautiful pot of lamb stew prohibited. But if it's a scoop of ice cream, and it could be thought that, that's actually more than 1/60th of the volume of what it falls into, then you're going to have a serious problem, especially because it's hot stew, and it's the hot one that controls. The lower one prevails, according to the view of Shmuel. And Shmuel said the lower one prevails. In his opinion, if the upper substance is hot and the lower one is cold, okay, so the permitted food remains permitted. But if the lower one is hot and the upper one is cold, then it's a real intermingling, and it's going to render the permitted food prohibited. We learned in the Mishna, if some of the gravy of the Paschal lamb dripped onto the earthenware and returned to it, one must remove its place. So that was the idea in the Mishna, that if you're cooking the Paschal lamb on a spit, some of the gravy goes down and then splatters off the very hot surface of the earthenware oven and then shoots back up into the lamb. So now the part of the lamb that received that boiling hot gravy, it wasn't cooked, it wasn't roasted in fire, it was boiled by its own gravy, and so that part of the meat needs to be taken away, needs to be removed from the Paschal lamb. It might enter your mind to say that this is referring to cold earthenware. Now, granted, according to the opinion of Rav, who said that the upper one prevails, it is due to this reason that one must remove its place, because the lamb is hot, it's cooking. According to Rav's view, the gravy goes and heats the earthenware, and then the earthenware heats the gravy, and when the gravy returns to the Paschal lamb, the lamb becomes roasted from the heat of the earthenware, and the Merciful One states in the Torah, roasted in fire and not roasted by something else, like a liquid. But according to the opinion of Shmuel, who said that the lower one prevails, since the earthenware is cold, it cools down the gravy. In that case, why must he remove its place? And the Gemara answers, as Rabbi Yirmiyah said that Shmuel said in the explanation of the Mishnah's next ruling in the case of gravy that dripped into flour, the Mishnah is referring to hot flour. Here too, it is referring to hot earthenware. Since the earthenware is already hot, it is a case of something hot that fell into something hot, even according to Shmuel. We also learned in the Mishnah that if some of the Paschal lamb's gravy dripped onto flour, one must remove a handful of flour from its place. Now, when I first read that, I found that very confusing. We understand that if the lamb is cooked by something other than the direct fire, then it becomes disqualified because God said in the Torah it has to be roasted over fire. But now we're saying that some of the gravy dripped into some flour that happened to be under it or in the kitchen or whatever, that now that flour and a whole handful of flour, not just where the drop of gravy is, but a whole handful of flour around where the drop of gravy hit that flour, needs to be discarded. Why do we have to get rid of the flour? What's going on here? Right? Flour is not something that we're commanded to eat. In fact, this is problematic when we're talking about the Paschal lamb. We're talking about flour, so I guess it must be like matzah meal, right? Or like it's this flour that's going to only be used for the purpose of making matzah. That's why you have flour in the kitchen. Okay, so why do we have to throw away this flour? And the answer is, well, if that flour is hot, right, and now this gravy that comes from the Paschal lamb drips into it, so the gravy is part of the Paschal lamb. If that gravy itself has now been heated by some hot flour, when that gravy wasn't cooked by fire, that gravy would be cooked by this hot flour that it fell into, and therefore that gravy is disqualified for eating, and anything that it mixes with is disqualified too. And that's why you got to get rid of that flour. It's not that we're commanded to eat flour. We're commanded to eat matzah on the first day of Passover, but that's not what this is about. This is about the fact that the gravy itself became disqualified because it was heated not by fire. It was heated by this hot flour, and therefore you have to get rid of the gravy and whatever it touched. And where am I? Yes. So we also learned in the Mishnah that if some of the Paschal lamb's gravy dripped onto flour, one must remove a handful of flour from its place. It could enter your mind to say that this is talking about cold flour. Now, according to Rav, this would work because it was hot gravy that fell into cold flour, and the upper one prevails according to Rav. But actually, the law follows Shmuel, who said that the lower one prevails. So if it was cold flour, why would we have to get rid of it? And so the answer is, according to the opinion of Shmuel, who said the lower one prevails, if the flour is cold, it cools down the gravy. In that case, why do I need to say we need to remove a handful of flour from its place? It should be enough for one to remove a small amount from its place, and it should not be necessary to take anything more. With regard to this, Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of Shmuel, the Mishnah is referring to hot flour. The gravy is therefore roasted from the heat of the flour, and an entire handful of the flour, anything that might have come into contact with this disqualified gravy, needs to be discarded. We learned in the Mishnah, in a case where one smears the Paschal lamb with teruma oil, if the Paschal lamb belongs to a group of priests, they may eat it, as they are permitted to eat teruma, right? That very first 2% tithe that goes to the priest, they can eat it. In the case of olive oil, this is teruma of olive oil. So if that gets smeared on the Paschal lamb, okay, so that lamb who's smeared with oil, only priests could eat it because there's teruma oil on it. If it belongs to a group of Israelites, then if the Paschal lamb is still raw, so you just rinse it in order to remove the teruma oil. And if it is roasted, one must peel off the outer layer. Now granted, according to Rav, who said the lower one prevails, for this reason, it is sufficient to remove only the outer peel, because the upper one is cold and therefore the oil is not absorbed deeply into the meat. But according to Shmuel, who said the lower one prevails, since the meat which is on the bottom is hot, it absorbs the oil. In that case, why is it enough for it to be permitted only when only the outer peel is removed? It should be entirely forbidden, according to Shmuel. Why don't we say that the whole lamb is disqualified since it absorbed, while it was roasted, this teruma oil that only priests are allowed to eat? And the Gemara answers, smearing is different because it is done with only a minute amount. We have no concern that that oil is going to really penetrate the meat. It's only on its outer surface. Since one smears only a little bit of oil, there is not enough oil to render the entire Paschal lamb forbidden. We skip forward. Now we're basically at the top of the B side of page 76. Rav said, fatty kosher meat that one roasted in an oven together with lean kosher meat is forbidden. Now, the issue that we're going into here is, we've already discussed what happens if two foods come into contact with each other, where one is permitted and the other is prohibited. And will the prohibited substance render the permitted one prohibited? Either because it's prohibited because it's not kosher, perhaps it's swine, or because they would be permitted individually, but there would be a dairy and milk mixing that would render this mixture prohibited, right? So we saw that if they're cold and cold, then we could just rinse off and separate. Hot and hot, for sure, the thing that would have been permitted is now prohibited. And then Rav said, if something hot falls into something cold, it's considered like hot and hot because the upper one prevails. And Shmuel said it's the lower one that prevails. So something cold fell into something hot because it's the lower one that is hot. That would be like hot and hot mixing. That's with respect to contact, touching. The permitted and prohibited foods actually touch. Well, what if they're baked in the same oven, but they don't touch? Is there some sense of the airspace becomes filled with the aroma, like the sort of basically the gas that's coming off, not gas, but the aroma that comes off meat. Obviously, if you're cooking meat, it makes a nice smell in the house when you open the oven. It's because there's particles of that cooked meat all over the oven. Well, if two things that shouldn't touch are cooking in the same oven, they don't touch, but their aromas are mixing in the oven, what then? So that's the situation we're discussing now. Fatty kosher meat, fatty means it's going to give off more aroma when it's cooked. So fatty kosher meat that one roasted in an oven together with lean non-kosher meat is still forbidden, even if the two meats never came into contact with one another. They're saying lean non-kosher meat because it's like the kosher meat is going to give off a lot of aroma. The lean meat, it's lean, so it's going to give off very little. Nevertheless, the kosher meat is going to become prohibited, even if the two meats never came into contact with one another. What is the reason for this law? It is that they are flavored from one another. The fatty meat emits an aroma that is absorbed in the non-kosher meat, and then the aroma is transferred back to the kosher meat, causing the kosher meat to absorb some aroma from the non-kosher meat. This is the statement of Rav. Levi disagrees with Rav, and the law is actually going to follow Levi. And Levi said, the aroma does not cause meat to be forbidden. Even lean kosher meat that one roasted together with fatty non-kosher meat. So the non-kosher meat, so you can imagine right here, you have like a lean kosher steak in an oven with a fatty pork chop, and you would think, no way is this meat going to be permitted, right? The lean kosher steak cooked in an oven with this fatty pork chop, and it turns out that it's not going to render the meat prohibited. It's not going to render the kosher meat prohibited. This practice is prohibited. It's prohibited rabbinically. Okay, you still can't do this for sure, and that's why we kosher our ovens. But if it somehow happened, could the meat still be eaten? That's what we're discussing. So Levi said the aroma does not cause the meat to be forbidden. Even lean kosher meat that one roasted with fatty non-kosher meat is permitted. What is the reason for this law? although the non-kosher meat emits an aroma that is absorbed into the kosher meat, it is merely an aroma. And an aroma is nothing significant. The Gemara relates that Levi not only taught this law, he acted on it. And he did so in the house of the exilarch. Right? The exilarch is the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia. Right? So this is a very, very prominent household. The home of the exilarch. I mean, he's the leader of the Jewish community in Babylonia, and he himself is close with the government of the Babylonian king, the Persian king, actually. This was the kingdom of Persia, but, outpost in Babylonia. And yet the exilarch is considered third in line for the throne of all Persia. That's how prominent the Jews were in that kingdom. So in the house of the exilarch, Levi put his opinion into practice. And what did he do? With a kid and something else, right? So when the Gemara says something else, it actually means pork, right? So what did he do? He cooked a young goat with pork in the same oven, right? Or allowed the goat to be eaten after it had been cooked in an oven alongside, but not touching, pork. Right? So i.e. a pig that had been roasted together. Levi did not prohibit the meat of the young goat due to the aroma of the pig. And the Gemara raises an objection. One may not roast two Paschal lambs together due to the mixing, right? So you cannot take two Korban Pesachim. You can't take two Paschal offerings and bake them in an oven together. So now you're telling me that you could actually cook some kosher meat like from a goat along with pork in the same oven, and the kosher meat is still going to be permitted to eat, and yet we have a law that you can't take two, obviously kosher Paschal lambs and roast them in the same large, clay oven with a wood fire in there. Why not? And the reason that you can't cook two Paschal lambs in the same, fire roasting oven is due to mixing. So doesn't that indicate that we're concerned that their aromas will intermingle, and that's why we can't cook them in the same place? And therefore, we should learn from that you should not be able to eat this goat that was roasted in an oven where some pork was also roasting. What is it? Is it not prohibited due to the mixing of flavors, i.e. due to the aromas that waft from one piece of meat to the other? And this would pose a difficulty to the opinion of Levi. And the Gemara rejects this challenge. No, it is prohibited due to the mixing of carcasses. Meaning you can't cook two Paschal lambs in the same roasting earthenware oven because each lamb has its own group that is registered to it, as we've discussed a bunch of times, right? So when the temple is standing and we're bringing the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, a group of people have to agree in advance that they're going to eat that particular lamb. If you put two of these lambs in the same oven, when they take them out, they might get confused and the wrong group would get the lamb. That's what mixing is. That's the problem with mixing. That's what mixing means when it says you can't cook two lambs in the same oven. No, it is prohibited due to the mixing of carcasses. The groups who are roasting their Paschal offerings might accidentally switch offerings, in which case the offerings will be eaten by people who did not register for them. The Gemara adds, and so too, one can conclude that this explanation is reasonable from the fact that it is taught in the latter clause of the ruling that it applies even to two offerings where they are a kid and a lamb, right? Where they used a lamb and a goat. Different. You can use either one for the Paschal offering. It can be a lamb or it could be a kid. So even if you put a kid and a lamb in the goat, not put a kid and a lamb in the oven, you can't do it. So what's the chiddush of that? What new thing is being offered in that ruling, right? If you can't mix, just two offerings because of aroma, what difference does it make if one is a kid and one is a lamb? But if you're saying that you can't mix them because they might get confused, then a person might answer, okay, but this one is lamb and that one is goat. We're not going to get them confused. And the sages would answer, no, you might get them confused because once the meat comes out of the oven, it's just roasted meat. And so even if one is a kid and one is a lamb, you still can't do it because they might get confused. And that's what it means. You can't put them in the same oven because of mixing. That's it. So that's my teaching today. All right, let's go to your comments and questions. All right, today was, some technically challenging laws with respect to the Korban Pesach, and when does permitted and prohibited coming into contact with each other render the permitted item prohibited. But even though we don't bring the Korban Pesach anymore, we don't bring the Paschal lamb since the temple was destroyed almost 2,000 years ago, this idea of keeping permitted and prohibited from touching and what happens if they accidentally do definitely comes up all the time when one is keeping a kosher kitchen. Oh, it looks like nobody has questions, but we have got a comment from Brinna. Ever since I started learning with you, I have shared some Torah in each of my classes. I keep it simple and relevant, but I do it because I don't know who is or isn't Jewish in my classes. And in colleges, Jewish students are often shy or even afraid to identify. I am inspired to do this by you and Nina. Thank you. Thank you, Brinna. That means so much to us. But for sure, this is what we believe. We are all accidental Talmudists. Anything that we learn that inspires us, there is a plague of ignorance, right? There's a plague of Jewish ignorance, tragically, these days. And if we can take some of these teachings that we find inspiring and just put them out there, and you never know, you just never know where that seed is going to germinate, who's going to hear it, who's going to be touched by it, who's eventually going to start doing more mitzvahs because of it. And I'll just say one last thing. If you are a Jewish male and you have never wrapped tefillin or don't wrap tefillin regularly, think about it. Think about doing it. It's a major mitzvah. If you're a Jewish man, and you've never wrapped tefillin, right, the leather boxes and the straps that you do, it's a Torah commandment. And the difference between never having done it and having done it once is a huge, almost an infinite difference. And there is a Chabad rabbi in your city who is, so ready to help you wrap tefillin. And if you're a Jewish woman and you haven't lit Shabbos candles, or you don't light Shabbos candles regularly, there is, a Chabad rabbi and a Chabad rabbi's wife in your city who is very ready to help you do that. When you start doing these things just because God commanded us to do it, you realize, that life just acquires more meaning, because it's not just about us and what we're worried about and what we're trying to do and having pleasure and avoiding pain and saving up for retirement, etc. You're one of the Jewish people and you have a mission in this world. And if you're not Jewish, learn about those 7 Noahide laws, because all human beings are obligated in them. And while it seems pretty, straightforward, not to murder, not to steal, not to take the Lord's name in vain, learning about the Lord, which is the first Noahide commandment, well, that's Torah study right there. And there's just so much to learn. And anytime we're learning, we're bringing the whole world a little higher in its spiritual level, and preparing this world, right, to be a home for the divine presence in the dawn of the Messianic age. All right, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. You should have such a sweet Shabbos. May you and all your loved ones be healthy and well and joy-filled.